Welcome to English 1120. In this video, we'll talk about social dialects of English. Our goal is to introduce this concept of sociolinguistics. We'll also talk about a variety of different social dialects of English, and then discuss the impact or perception that social dialects can have on different audiences. Sociolinguistics is a subfield of linguistics. And this subfield focuses on how dialects change or language differences appear in different social or demographic groups. And so the interest here is in what ways do we see language happening differently depending on a person's social characteristics and how they may change language and perform differently than other social groups. This was related to two important words that we should probably understand. One of them is called register, and register is a form of the language that is used in a different context, often different social contexts. So whether we use one form of a language, maybe with certain groups of people, maybe at church we use another one, in education we use another one, at jobs or with friends, we use these different registers. Changing register, or changing the form of the language that we speak, is called code switching. And we switch codes naturally when we move into these different social groups. If we didn't, we would find that people would feel maybe uncomfortable or surprised at the kinds of language that we're using in certain contexts. Almost all of us use multiple registers of the same language depending on the social context. But the kinds of registers that are part of our language repertoire or part of our language system just depends on a variety of social factors. One of these social factors is gender. There are studies that show that men and women tend to use different forms of the language. Sometimes this is grammatical differences. For example, in English, men are more likely to use an n ending on ing words, whereas women are more likely to pronounce the ing ending. And so we see there's a pronunciation difference between those groups. In other languages, women might use more politeness grammatical markers in their language, and men might use more direct markers. So because of this, there are these differences we may notice. In fact, I remember reading a story of a young man who did a study abroad and had a girlfriend from the target culture and spent a lot of time with his girlfriend and with the friends of his girlfriend who were also all women. And that's how he learned how to speak the language. But what he discovered is that his girlfriend and these other women were speaking a more feminine dialect of the language. And so when he spoke the dialect he had been learning from them in other contexts, people didn't quite know how to understand him because the form of the language didn't match with what they perceived he should be speaking based on his gender. Now, these gender differences in dialect are certainly, I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that they're biologically driven. They are socially driven. They're just driven by cultural groups that we expect men and women maybe to talk or use language differently. So because of these cultural norms or cultural expectations, people sometimes subconsciously adopt these different forms of the language. Now, we also have age dialects. People from older generations tend to speak a different language than people from younger generations. Slang makes a big difference here, right? Slang changes over time. And so what's considered current slang for an older generation could be very different from the kinds of slang that are used in younger generations. Sometimes this is just vocabulary words, but it also can influence grammar. What are acceptable ways to use words? How do we put words together? We also have cultural dialects. Now, this is a little bit different from what we've been talking about with regional dialects of English. Regional dialects of English have to do with people who live in different geographical areas. Now, they may also be different cultural areas, but the primary factor is that they live in different locations. With cultural dialects, that could be based more on a person's ethnicity or cultural group. The difference here is that even if they live in the same area, the same city, the same region, they may have different forms of the language that are based on their contact with other members of that cultural group. And so they may have developed different pronunciation for words, different grammatical structures, different vocabulary words to refer to things that are specific to that cultural group, even though they live in the same region or location with people who speak another cultural dialect. We also have social dialects that change depending on our education, depending on our occupation, and a variety of other factors. We develop words, grammar, pronunciation that fit certain contexts of social use of language. And as we mentioned, those could be described as different registers. And so then we switch, we code switch, we use different registers depending on who's listening to us. The kinds of language we use maybe with our grandparents is different than the language you might use with our friends, or maybe with our coworkers or a professor, or with someone in a church context. So all of these factors influence social dialects. The way we use or our choice of social dialect can influence how people perceive us. Some social dialects have high prestige. So when we hear someone speaking that dialect, we maybe assign them intelligence or maybe power or authority. Some social dialects may have a more correctness perception. Now, we've talked about how one grammatical variety is not necessarily more correct than another, but that doesn't stop people within a society viewing certain dialects as being more correct than others. And so we need to be aware that if we choose to use a particular dialect of a social language variation, it may be perceived as more or maybe less correct. And that could have implications on how people perceive us and value our ideas. Some that are maybe considered maybe less correct or are associated maybe with less intelligent speakers may at the same time be considered more approachable, more warm. A high prestige, maybe high power or high authority dialect may not be approachable. So there may be reasons why we want to code switch between different dialects because of the ways we want to influence our audience, whether we want to show that we're in a position of authority or that we're a friendly person or that we're part of an in-group and we want to talk like people in the group that we're speaking to. And so we want to use the forms of the language, the grammatical structures, the pronunciation that will let that group know I belong here, I'm part of you. Even if it's maybe different than what we might use in a different social context. So we've talked about the field of sociolinguistics and how it studies different social variation in language. And we've talked about a variety of different factors that can influence social dialects, such as gender, age, job, education, and ethnic group. Then we've talked about how different dialects of a language may influence our perception among our audience. And so we may want to make choices about how we code switch and which dialects we use in order to have the target influence we want on that audience.